Hello, everyone. Thank you all for those really thoughtful and thought-provoking. How should we spread out here?
I'll spread out. Make sure you're not sitting separate.
For all of the presentations. I had a bunch of questions, and now I have a million notes, and I probably won't be able to make sense of them. But I also really wanted to thank Christina and the other organizers today, especially for bringing people together to be part of this conversation who are outside of the museum world. I think I've heard from everyone about collaboration, and I'm feeling very hopeful, I think, about the future because people are really open to collaboration and thinking about it and talking about it. But I also think doing it is hard. You know, I mean, it's one thing to collaborate with people in the glam sector. I've never heard that before, but I really like that term, the glam sector. And I know we all try to collaborate with community, and that is sometimes works and it sometimes doesn't. Right. And we haven't really yet explored how we can collaborate with other fields. I think that's really interesting too. I think we just need to be as collaborative and expansive in our thinking as we can if we're really going to make change in our systems and institutions that are often mired in traditional Western ideologies. So that brings me to my first question, which is, the three of you, as a designer, an artist, and an educator, what if you were all brought together to design a new model or a space for the preservation, presentation, and engagement with cultural artifacts? How would you represent culture today in new ways, possibly with new technologies? I feel like you might be the ideal team to think about the design, the objects, and how to expose hidden histories that have not been talked about before, and what kind of engagement, meaning-making activities would be in place.
Well, I don't know, I just met y'all today, but I imagine that we probably would problematize the question to begin with, or at least I would. I think a lot of what, for me, feels very important is that these things are grounded in, all right, if we're gonna create a new, what did you say, space for the?
Preservation, presentation,
and engagement, preservation, presentation, and engagement of culture. To me, I'd say, okay, well, for whom, for what, to what term, to what aims, right. To what ends? Why are we doing it? Yeah. Who wants it? Why is it us? What is the culture? Oh, there are all these questions, and I know it seems like it's complicating it. It's like a little annoying and like academic sometimes, to be like, I don't want to answer the question. But I think it is the question. Yeah. Because for me, it is. And to me, I think I work in the reason I'm an artist is because for me, it just was the space where I felt like I had the most space. Mm-hmm. That's it. Actually, it's not because I love museums. I like art making because art making can be so broad. It can be anything, and you can change how people think about something, which to me is so important, but isn't valued very much. But that doesn't. So I don't always think everything has to be preserved or everything has to be. These things they depend on the moment, on the context. Mm-hmm. So that's where I would start, and I pass it to my teammates.
Well, given, I wish I could be an artful dodger and answer the question at the same time like you did. I don't quite have that skill, but I'm going to take the impulse toward cultural exchange that I heard in your question, and something that Glenn was getting at about recasting heroes of stories, and begin with stories. So one thing I like to do when I'm more creative in my teaching, I don't always have access to those realms, but I like to try to link oral traditions, print literacies, and digital possibilities. And so I would imagine that in such a space or in creating such a space, the initial query would be, tell us a story that somehow connects with some collective that you care about and that you connect with individually. And from there, what I want to do, the reason I say that is a low stakes way to get at broader truths and to be able to kind of see them in connection with each other. And, you know, I mentioned remix earlier. And so I think I would then ask people to either kind of swap some of those stories or take the one that they shared and retell it in a different medium or modality and get people sharing with each other in that. And from there, we can start to pull out some collective values and some collective desires and needs from which we could actually create that space. I think that's how I go at it.
Yeah, and to build on what Adam said, like, I think if you look at how I'm going to say young people just because it's if you look at how young people like go through a museum and like what are the things that they're doing, and then it's kind of like it's kind of like Instagram culture, right? Mm-hmm. Where the object is to kind of like take a picture with a cool looking thing, blah blah blah. And I think what Adam's talking about is much more interesting, which is what did that make you think of? Like what kind of thoughts occurred to you? Like how does this affect your life? So you're kind of interlinking the narrative of the object, the stories that are in the museum with how it affected you and how you are growing and changing. And then how can we promote an exchange of those things? And how can we do it like, again, leveraging technology, but the technology is not the story. The story is the story.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of young people, and because we're in an educational institution, I can't help but think about how we need to train the next generation of cultural workers. What do we need in this field, and how are they being prepared for that? And I'm thinking specifically, you know, because we have Adam and Glenn here from interdisciplinary programs at Stanford, the Institute for Diversity in the Arts, Science, Technology, and Society. The D School is very interdisciplinary. Why are those types of programs valuable and necessary for the next generation?
I'll use Bootsy Collins to try to get at something I heard from Glenn and saw on one of his slides. I won't give you the first part of the line. That's not quite appropriate for the space. But the second part of the line is from his song, I'd Rather Be With You. It's a live performance in Louisville back in the 70s, Bootsy's Rubber Band. Ain't nothing good unless you play with it. Now, the challenge there, we take our work and sometimes ourselves so effing seriously. And the circumstances in which we work kind of force us to be so serious. You know, trying to break that up would be one thing that would be on my mind.
Yeah, and I think if we think about like the interdisciplinary, like new ideas come from the kind of the remix of things. And so part of the reason why we build in what we call a radical collaboration at the D School, which has that interdisciplinary lens, is we believe that like the new and interesting ideas will come from those kind of collisions of, and I think being interdisciplinary is just like one of many dimensions in which you can kind of increase that diversity. And I mean, even if you look at the way like prompt engineering works in AI now, like a lot of it is the art of it is actually remix culture. And it's being able to kind of take these different elements and kind of mix them together that produce this kind of novel and interesting output.
Mimi, what would you say for the next generation of artists? What would they need?
Oh, I thought I was off the hook.
Nope.
You're not going to answer anything today.
Well, let me see. What do they need? Okay. I don't know if this is my full answer, but off the top of my head, I think I agree with this, like, disciplines, the thing that disciplines offer is depth, which is great.
Yeah.
That is so important. I don't want to like dismiss that. It's so important. So I do think that is necessary. And the problem of them is that they enclose knowledge in some ways, and that sometimes the best way to do something actually might not be in your field.
Right.
It might be in another. And there isn't an incentive to step out. There might not be an incentive to step outside of it, depending on the kind of institution you're in and the type of reward systems that it has. So I think what I would say people need is like depth, the ability and time to go deep into things, but also an understanding of when to switch and when to work, when to like collaborate with others, when to pull somebody else in. And I think of that as like a sense you develop in the same way that sometimes journalists will be like, oh, that's a story. I just can tell when something's a story. You know, knowing like this is a moment to come together with someone else. This is a moment to go deep.
Yeah.
I think that sense.
I love that.
I know I want to open it up to the audience soon, but I'm trying to decide between all of my questions. I guess I've been hearing a lot about how we are receivers of this technology and we're using the technology that is given to us. And you all went to visit Google and Apple, and I wonder, were there thoughts about how we as artists and cultural workers can be influencing or affecting the development of these new technologies as opposed to just receiving what they produce and dealing with it and trying to make them work for us? Why can't we be at the table in the development rooms? Why, maybe there's some artist in residence at some of these tech companies. How much influence do they have? How much influence should they have?
I'm marinating, so I
Okay. I thought you were about to say something. Yeah.
Can I just say that we went there, and it's a two-way thing, right? A conversation. Conversation goes in two directions, and someone also has to be willing to have it. And I'm not sure that some of those tech companies are willing to have it.
I think another way of kind of looking at the question is, and I'm sorry if I'm like kind of provoking the people in this room with this, but if you think about this idea of receiving, think about the way museums are structured. Like it's not just technology that's being that has this kind of receivership kind of relationship. So I think part of it is part of that willingness to have the conversation is also being able to look kind of reflectively at yourself as well, and in how can we both the museum, the cultural worker and the technologist, how can you both kind of change that relationship together versus being like, you're the one who needs to change, and like I'm like, that's one way of looking at it.
And yeah, please bring others in.
Well, I would just say sometimes perhaps this exchange is not really necessary. Let them produce what they do, and then so the artists have a target to fight against. Perhaps that's also the way to make our culture more interesting.
Well, I like that point, and what I would add to it from the perspective of appropriated technologies that you heard me gesture toward earlier. As cultural workers, we get to look at the places where everyday people break and remake technologies, and we can be inspired by those acts rather than simply what gets rolled out in the next product release, right? Or the next time we have to click on the updated terms of service, which I'm like 20 generations behind on, So my colleague at Georgia Tech, I might have tried to write about it too, but my colleague Andre Brock and my colleague at Northeastern, Meredith Clark, they write about Black Twitter in ways that have important lessons about technologies from what these everyday users have done in sort of bending the interface to their will.
Yeah.
And so I think as cultural workers, we can look for those spaces and not have to worry as much about what's happening, down the road.
I do think, too, this just makes me think of a few things. I don't know how they all come together, but one is, yes, about reappropriating technology. I think about there's some folks in like the crip justice and disability justice communities who are like, this chair is technology because it extends our capabilities. Your eyeglasses are technology. Like we can expand that definition, and doing that sometimes does allow us to see more clearly that folks are already remixing, remediating, making sense of tools in different ways. At the same time, we do know that there is this huge tech industry. When we talk about technology, mostly we're talking about computational technology. We know that. And there is just no ignoring that a lot of these tech companies are operating according to these profit motives, which is that's what controls a lot of what comes out.
Yeah.
That and hype cycles. That's why
Right.
AI now is again like big. And everybody is putting pressure on each other in these spaces. These are just points. These aren't answers. And then the third, I can't even remember what the third point was. So yeah.
Well, let's open it up to others who have questions.
Hi, thank you so much. Thanks for the shout out, Adam. So I will say, I want to sort of bring it back to what's hanging me up, right, around technologies, and granting what you said about personifying the technology, but I hear my students, staff, making it a human as well, a human they go to read an archive. So for me, I want to understand how it is that we impact the fact that they're now going to be using these technologies to produce papers, shallow history. They don't read cursive. ChatGPT can't read cursive. The bros aren't reading cursive. So that indecipherable, they're trusting third generation ideas about what was indecipherable because they're not looking at the actual words. So then how are we helping them read against the grain? Like those are the things that I'm interested in really thinking about with these technologies, is because that's part of what at the Museum of the African Diaspora, that's our modus operandi, right? The things I'm producing are about disciplinary porosity, but also embodied knowledge. The ways that those don't reach the same level of evidence, right? So what accounts for evidence that gets read into these things is based on whiteness. So how are we contending with that? I feel like that's the subtext and undercurrent of a lot of what we're talking about. The false neutrality, slipperiness of whiteness, and how it's embedded in the technology, but we don't treat it as such. So I'm wondering how you all are sort of addressing that level of interaction.
So I hear two things in the question, right? I hear this concern about legibility and remove or distance from the primary thing that we might be trying to make meaning of, and then related and distinct. I'm hearing, the point that we're always encountering not only whiteness, as Toni Morrison would talk about it, but ingrained systems of white supremacy that move in these ways that are not legible or that don't have to be articulated, as we heard from one of our speakers earlier. I'm not even going to pretend that I've got 5 on that, to use an idiom, but so in the space of the museum, because I grew up spending my childhood at the Cleveland Museum of Art, and it was respite for me, as much as it was a moment to encounter art. And since I've been talking about remix a bit, I wonder what would happen if some engagement with young people, since we're talking about young people, in a museum like MOAD or CMA, is about encountering the galleries, but what's the formal name y'all use for the gallery card that explains and puts the wall text labels, boom. So if, along with trying to get some collective of young people to encounter particular exhibitions and galleries and be comfortable in those spaces, you see students in galleries all the time have, art classes, they've got to draw from what they see in the gallery. But if I've got an activity built around, a literacy activity built around those wall notes, right? Those labels, and trying to tell the story that you see in your own terms or own ways of expression of what you see in that artifact or that image, but it becomes an opportunity to teach about the interpretive moves that happen in the index, right? Or in the wall, in the card, the label. I think I think that can get at some of the distance, the remove you're talking about, and can get at some of the legibility that you're talking about, while still meeting people in places that could be comfortable for them. So that's a thought.
I have thought. Oh,
Go ahead. No, please go.
Please, let's not do this.
Okay. So we both play bass. So like,
Oh, wow.
we have this like. No, you go.
But you play in the root of the ninth, though.
So this doesn't solve everything in your question, but I think one way to look at it, and this kind of builds on what Adam was saying, is more actively engage people, especially young people, in sense making in museums, and make that a more conscious activity. And then that's where you can start to sort of question and interrogate the things. It's not just a matter of having like alternate narratives, but it's the person there putting their own kind of interpretation and narrative and into it. Because I think there's, I don't know, and I think this is kind of like the challenge of museums, where how can we more actively engage people in the, it's not just objects in a physical space,
Right.
but it's if you think about it, like, what is really a museum?
Right.
A museum is not the objects in a physical space. A museum is, I think, is like that engagement.
Yeah.
Right? And then so when you create that active engagement and bring a lot of different people, a diverse set of people into the museum in that kind of way, kind of construction of the meaning of it, then those different narratives will help kind of interrogate like the different stories that are there.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Here's what I'm going to say. This time I remember all my points. Okay, first off, I really do, I strongly believe when new technology comes out, you have this window of time where things are a little bit all up in the air, and before things have crystallized, where you get to decide the terms of that. Nothing, you said this, nothing is, we shouldn't naturalize anything. Nothing has to be the way it is. Mm-hmm. We're in when we talk about the future, the present actions are what decide what happens in the future. So we're in the moment now. Now, like literally right now is a time where we're figuring out the terms of new technology. I don't think we should give up any of our power or agency in this. We are also the people who do that, not just the ones who look at it happening.
Right.
And our young people do that too, and they're already doing it. So we just get to step in and be like, okay, what does this mean? Let's like contextualize it. Let's situate it. Now let's talk, And young people get that, I think. So that's one, is like first holding on to the fact that we are all like, in general, all of us can play a role in this. Because even, I will say, I know we put a lot of power on the tech companies, but it really is push and pull. When they sense the hype, then they do this, then somebody else does this.
Yep.
It's an ecosystem. We're all affecting each other. That's one. And then the second thing that then comes from that is, like you're talking about these systems and the logics and the modalities that they optimize for. This reminds me of a conversation lots of us were having in the space about facial recognition, where it was like, should this exist? What does this mean? A lot of people were like, oh my gosh, these systems, they can't recognize like Black women, oh my gosh. And then weirdly, the answer that a lot of people came to, they were like, let's get as much data about us in there as possible. Amazing, now we're recognized.
Nah.
Like, is that what we wanted? Do we want to be embedded?
Right.
Maybe we also have to recognize, I think this is a very artist thing to say, but there is power also in the spaces outside of that.
Boom.
That's so powerful. Let's not give up that power either. And then the third thing that I love about this question is it's not about the technology, actually. It's not at all. You're talking about these good things like power and values and all of this and pushing against this like dominant epistemology. You're like, how do we do that? And we need spaces where we can do that. And all of y'all run museums. Those are spaces where you can do that. Like, you have it. This is the perfect room to be thinking about this. For me at least, museums, the best ones are these spaces where you do get to have this kind of education that you can't get maybe in school, or you learn from someone who you otherwise wouldn't have been in contact with. That's so powerful. That's to say it's not a losing battle. There's opportunity here.
Hi. So I'll preface by saying that while I've been sitting here, I kind of look around and no shade at all, but I've been trying to find people that are my age. And I have been unfortunately disappointed to find very few. And I really think that, saying no shade, nothing to feel bad about, but I think that signals to kind of what you all are talking about, because I struggle with this a lot. I'm a museum worker, I work in curatorial, and I've kind of been leading some more digital initiatives almost that have fallen on my lap by just natural selection, let's say. And I'm really deeply interested in it, of course. But one thing that I really, in a good way, but get really tired of is hearing people talk about young people instead of talking with young people. Like, I'm right here, we can talk, it's fine. But yeah, no, it really is a thing. And I think something that I think about a lot is that generational gap. And, having programs like the D School and what you all are doing is absolutely integral to that. But I also think that generationally, there's a bit of a shift that's also happening that's based on a previous model that older people know better,
Yeah.
And in this particular case, when it comes to technology, I think it's very easy for people to talk about it in terms of communities and race and ethnicity and all these things and saying we have to talk with them. But I don't see a similar kind of impetus happening in terms of generation, of saying, like, honestly, people my age and younger than me, because I'm not even like the TikTok generation. I mean, I am on TikTok, but there's more than what I do. I think there's like a digital fluency and just a completely different way of seeing the world that it is also a form of a different fountain of knowledge. And I think that if this work is only happening in a very pedagogical way, like in a classroom setting of let me contextualize it for you, that can be a little pedantic as well, And so I wonder if you guys have thoughts about how to strike that balance, and specifically on how to encourage more autonomy and agency within an older generation to educate themselves about things that are technology focused or based. Because one thing that I struggle with in my work in museums is kind of like feeling like I can't really do as much progress or evoke transformative things in my work because there's such a huge hurdle that gets to a point, and I don't mean it in a bad way, but at some point, me leading a certain project can end up in me having to explain the internet to someone, and that's really like not really within the scope of what I want to be doing, right? And so I don't know if you guys have thoughts about that.
Well, I'll just say this very quickly. This is a moment where I get to shout out Alon. Alon might have had to step out. She's got a lot of things going on, but our director for IDA, what she leads and really helped create in our fellows program is a space where student artists get to explore these issues on their own terms, not in the context of a class where their professor or their advisor is going to tell them how to go about it. These juniors and seniors, they get to chart the questions and figure them out for themselves in community with each other. So if anybody knows, some deep pockets that might want to endow something like that, please talk to Deborah so she can talk to Alon. But it really is a valuable, despite my playful plug, it really is a valuable initiative that lets young folk make meaning and deal with big questions on their own terms.
And I think that flow of information is really important back up to our generation as well. I mean, I think you're completely right. There's all of these systems and structures in place where we talk about intergenerational exchange. Everybody's been saying that, but usually you think of that as wisdom being imparted on the young folks. But I am learning, being in Stanford, I'm learning just as much from the students here than they could ever learn from me. So what are the systems that we have in place, though, that allow for that and that make, put us on equal footing?
This is a horribly technological answer to this, but one experiment I was playing with last night was it was with ChatGPT, and I said, explain this technology. I won't say what the technology was, but explain this technology to someone who was born in 1946. And that's when my mom was born. It was my mom's birthday too, and I was like,
oh.
Wow, this is actually kind of useful. How this can do. But I think you're absolutely right. It's with I would say on the other side of it with young people with design for learning last fall, we would have students create video, but we didn't tell people how to make video. We kind of like let them kind of find their own voice. We're always there as resources, but we're not there to tell people what to do, but we're there to kind of, as educators, we're there to provide sort of like guidance and possible starting points, but then let people form it. But I think what you're bringing up, which I think is a really important question, is how do we get more not so young people like involved in that kind of interaction with technology? And I don't think you can make anybody do it. I think you just have to find people who, who are interested and curious and are willing to be vulnerable with it. Because I think a lot of the issue that comes up is it's not so much like I don't want to know. It's kind of I feel like I'm going to embarrass myself, right? And then so if you deal with that human need of fear of embarrassment and let people kind of experience it together, maybe even make that thing like an intergenerational thing where everybody's kind of like feeling that vulnerability together and creating that space to do it, then people will engage in it. So, but I think it's an excellent point. We shouldn't treat it's a completely not important or completely different problem. But I think if we look at the dynamics of vulnerability and fear of embarrassment, I think that goes a long way. Mm-hmm.
Just because we're talking about music as well in this, and I'm kind of we have now excluding school kids, 73% of my visitation is under 35. That is not 73% of the curatorial staff's ages.
Right.
Now that's cool. We have video games. We do the intergenerational learning. Mimi visited recently. She can attest for what it's like and all that.
It's cool.
It's cool, yeah, which is good.
It's good.
But I guess one of the things I've been sort of thinking about as you've been talking to, and this also speaks to the Black Twitter question too, is museums are very caught up in what things mean, right? But when I think about my music stuff, so I've been into sample-based music and remixing. I have a whole other life in music. When I was growing up, samples were a source of knowledge. Mm-hmm. So tracking a drum break back to its original source, tracking a sample used in a particular beat, whatever, was a way of me finding, crate digging other things. And there was a cultural knowledge exchange going on between the meaning of the sample and the historical source tracking of that. Now, when I hear music nowadays that's produced, and I'm thinking here of drum and bass, particularly the amen break, the Winston's amen break, super important break, probably the most sampled beat ever. And it was tied very much to a particular sampler in the early 90s, late 80s that made this time kind of stretching possible. Anyway, whole other story. What's interesting about that is that now that we're getting another generation making music in the same kind of style, which is completely detached from the original meaning of that amen break. And in fact, the amen break in its original form has less value now for these new producers because it's about the feeling of the beat, not the source of the beat. And I think this might speak to what's happening in music, but also in meme culture too. When my teenagers make and share memes, there is no one meaning in it anymore. It is simply an ephemeral, it's oral culture. Its meaning is purely contextual in the present. And I think that is very destabilizing for museums who want to be like the crate digger who's like, you've got to find the original source of this thing.
Provenance,
right? Yeah, exactly. And people are like, no, I don't care. It just sounds amazing in the club. I just want the feeling. And so there's this sort of real tension, I think, between the source and provenance and the feel. And I think that's the same in internet culture. And I'm very curious about internet orality, I guess, around how does that play out when, there's some fabulous meme accounts on TikTok and Instagram from young museum workers who are remixing and remaking but in ways that only make sense in their micro communities. And so how do we get that sort of, it's sort of like the balkanization of the internet is like the balkanization that COVID has brought us to. But it feels like it's something deep in museology around how do we get out of provenance. I mean, we can't be a museum director and not care about provenance, right? Like that's super, you can't ever say that. But it feels like we might be in a mode, and I'm super curious about the music and internet culture people here. Does it matter that you're detached from the source?
There's also,
Yeah.
okay, sorry.
So I'll say no, and what I'll offer is there are new folklores emerging in all of that collision. We tend to think of folklore as, ooh, that's way back in the oral tradition. But there's folklore emerging now with sets of meanings that even from that mashed up, kind of way of dealing with meme culture, where the references still matter in how they get deployed. So that's my guess.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple other things I would add to that. One is that, like, in terms of not appreciating the source, if you look at the history of rock and roll, there's plenty of like not appreciating the source, right? Like that's not a new thing, right? And then kind of I'm providing two sort of counter examples, and then the other one is I think a really interesting thing if you go on YouTube and look up any popular show and then search show and then Easter eggs, right?
Yep.
And so there's this obsession with finding sources and references and stuff like that. So I agree there's definitely a current where the sourcing is kind of disappearing or becoming not important, but I think it's kind of a mixed current. And I think there's things to be learned from like Easter egg culture that are kind of interesting because there's this it's like this hunger for sources, which is almost like maniacal and crazy at times. Like if you look. It is, yeah. I mean, especially like a good community to tap into is like Star Wars. Like Star Wars is it's a very diverse set, but like I think that's probably what's at the root of it.
Trek. No.
I thought you were going to talk about the Mandalorian finale. That's why I was like.
Well, we'll end on that note.
Okay.
I think you are staying up here. Is that right?
Oh. You as in Glenn or you as in?
We still.
Oh, okay. Okay.